Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today we're joined by Dr. Goetz. Goetz. I was going to say Goetz again. She's Associate Professor of Psychology at California State University, San Bernardino. She does research in evolutionary psychology, specifically human mating strategies and mating-related psychology, and we're going to talk about that today. So, Dr. Goetz, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So let's start perhaps with this question. I've already talked about this with other guests on the show, but just to brush up on it, let's say, what are the most well-established mate preferences for men and women?
So mate preferences are something that have been studied for a long time now. We've been asking people about what they want in a mate for decades. And the thing I actually like starting with now is the most striking thing about men's and women's mate preferences is that they actually tend to be pretty similar. So for most things, men and women are really looking for the same thing. They want especially for a long-term partner. They want somebody who's kind and understanding. They want somebody who listens to them. They want somebody who's healthy, who's going to last a while. They want somebody who's intelligent. They want somebody who they can have a good cooperative relationship with. But then there's also certain mate preference dimensions where we do see sex differences. And so the most striking one tends to be when we compare men's and women's, how interested they are, or how important it is that a partner has resources or the ability to acquire resources. And that's one where we see women placing a greater premium on that than men do. And the other dimension where we tend to see a decent sex difference is in the preference for physical attractiveness in a mate. It's something that men tend to place a greater premium on than women do. But really, for lots of the dimensions, we see high similarity in men and women because, the sort of things that make it so it's somebody that you can be with for the long haul and have a good functioning relationship with are the same things, the things that make a good cooperation partner.
Mm-hmm. And these mate preferences, are they all advertised, or are people even consciously aware of them, or do we get to know what they are by studying people in specific contexts?
It's a great question. How do we get information about these things, right?
Yeah.
How do we know, right? And it's, sort of everything that you said, right? There's an extent to which we advertise these, and certainly we're motivated to advertise these because at the same time, while somebody else is, evaluating, us as a mate, we often are also trying to attract mates on our own. So we're, engaging in that mate attraction process, which involves us signaling information about where we fall on those different traits. But that also sets the stage for deception on these things. If we know that potential partners are interested in somebody who is intelligent, right, then we're motivated to perhaps portray ourselves as more intelligent than we actually are. In our modern world now, the layers and ways in which we can achieve that deception have become, have exploded, right? If you think about information you advertise on dating apps, right? Or just your social media, presence in general, right? What information you put up there or don't put up there. And there's subtle ways we try to do that, right? So status is another thing we look for, right, in mates. Where do they fall within, sort of a status hierarchy, or, what is their relative status compared to others in a group? You scroll through Instagram, right? It's all, a bunch of it is just about status signaling, right? Oh, look at this fancy vacation. Well, in pre-COVID times, this fancy vacation that I'm on, or look at these, expensive things I have, or these high-profile people that I'm around, right? These sort of subtle ways of trying to signal or deceive, right, about where you fall on this. We also get this information from other people. So we ask other people about other people all the time, right? And so that's a really interesting source of information about, well, what are other people like? And when you think about those conversations, do you know this guy, or do you know this gal? And, what do you think about her? the information that gets conveyed there hits on these mate preference dimensions, right? And that's also another source of deception, right? Maybe this person wants to convince you this person is a certain way or doesn't have certain characteristics. And so that's all filtered through, their own motives and what they're trying to, convince you about somebody.
Mm-hmm. Are people aware of their own mate value when they are trying to decide with whom they should mate or something like that? I mean, because since we have phenomena like self-deception and overconfidence and things like that, I mean, when people are looking for a mate, do they take into account their actual mate value?
It's an interesting question. Across, when we look at studies in psychology across lots of information like this, where we're trying to figure out, do people actually have an awareness of their own standing on some relative dimension, whether it's mate value or any of the components of mate value, right? Intelligence, physical attractiveness, status, anything. Sometimes you see these effects where people, self-inflate, right? When they're asked about this. You ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you fall? If you're doing a really rudimentary measure of mate value, let's say, compared to everybody else, 1 to 10, people are like, I'm a 7, everybody's a 7. They all think they're 7s. They can't all be 7s. But what they say might be different from internally what's going on in their mind and how that is then influencing their actual mating decisions, mate selection, mate behavior. And that's a really interesting question, because we do tend to see that sort of when we do these sort of more objective kind of measures of mate value, we do see that it tends to track, where if you're lower in mate value, you have a lower in mate value partner. And if you're higher, you have a higher in mate value partner. We see this play out in the actual behavioral data. But it's this interesting question of when there's that disconnect between what a person is really thinks about themselves, if there is a disconnect, right? Or they consciously think or they say versus, there might be some real assessment in their mind of where they actually fall to actually motivate them towards partners that they would be more likely to be able to get versus ones that they would be less likely able to get. And some of that assortative mating for mate value, where we tend to end up with people who are similar to us in mate value, also might be a consequence, not necessarily of our own knowledge about our mate value, but of us getting the best we can, right? So if the people who are highest in mate value are able to attract other people who are highest in mate value, well, that means the next highest are able to attract the next highest, and it just sort of falls down from there. The 10s already take up all the 10s. The 9s take up the 9s. The 8s, well, the 9s and 10s are gone, so they get the other 8s. And then you end up mating assortatively, even if everybody is trying to go for the highest partner, right? The highest mate value potential partners. But I do think that there is evidence that, at least with what's going on in our minds, we have some sense of where we fall. Whether or not we are consciously aware of that and accurately communicate that to others is sort of a different thing.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that people adjust their mate preferences when they take into account their own mate value? I mean, for example, if I'm a 6, perhaps I will adjust my preferences just to look for 6, 7s, perhaps, just for me to not feel bad when I get rejected or something like that.
Right. And we do have evidence of this. So there have been some good studies, particularly with samples of women, but it plays out for men too, where we do see that women who are higher in physical attractiveness and also higher in mate value, to the extent that that physical attractiveness is linked to mate value, have higher standards. So when we do these studies of their preferences, they say, sort of across all of the mate preference dimensions, they say, yep, I want a guy who's physically attractive, who has resources, who will be a good parent, who will be really loyal, who will do, all of these things. Whereas women lower in physical attractiveness and lower in mate value, they aren't as strongly, they don't rate these things as quite as important across all the dimensions. It's important, but it's not as important. It's not as important, right? And so it demonstrates that their standards do shift, or at least their standards are different. for women in these different circumstances. And it's, exactly what you said, right? So in the, if we're thinking about this, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, right? So, when I think about these things, I think about, okay, how, we've got these, programs operating in our mind that, were shaped by, features of our ancestral past to motivate decisions and behaviors that ancestrally would have benefited fitness. And so if you spent, all your time going for the 10, but never getting the 10 because you're a 5, right? It's not going to work out so well for you and your ability to find a mate, maintain a mate, have offspring, have a relationship, right? Versus if you're actually, toggling your expectations and going for somebody who's more available to you.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, could the mate value of a particular person also influence how they advertise their mate preferences?
So in at least one study that I've done, I've seen sort of similar things with what people are advertising to what they're stating for those preferences, where, again, this was a study of women. And in one of the studies I had done, I had women film a short little video clip as though it would be posted to an online dating website. And I gave them really free rein. I didn't constrain them. I didn't say, you need to talk about these things or that things. I just said, oh, we're trying to start a dating website at this university, and I want to get some pilot videos to see what would go up there and how this would work. Like, here's a minute, just say what you would say, right? And after the women made the videos, I then had them coded by other people and coded for how attractive the women were. I also had the women answer questions about their own mating strategy. And then I also coded what was said in those videos. So what did they actually say and talk about? And what I found is the more attractive women, they talked more about the things that they really wanted in a mate. I want a guy who is like this, has this, and they were listing those things that were important to them. The less attractive women didn't do as much of that. They tended to talk a little bit more about themselves. They said, oh, I'm this way, I'm that way, I like doing this, I like walking my dog, but they weren't really communicating their sort of requirements in the same way that the more attractive women were. And so it was this, interesting sort of glimpse into, what they're sort of conveying about themselves, right? And, it's, you gotta be careful about over-interpreting too much, right? But, one possible thing to glean from that, is the women who are higher in mate value, are going to advertise, yep, I've got these standards and you need to meet these standards. Whereas the women lower in mate value aren't quite going to behave the same way. And certainly are still going to advertise positive things about themselves, right? They're, trying to attract a mate, but aren't advertising this same, I've got these standards and somebody needs to meet them to, be able to be with me. So there's just those interesting sort of subtle differences that might be at play with how we're advertising, what we're interested in, and what we're trying to convey to potential mates.
Mm-hmm. Does it have something to do with managing social reputation? Because, I mean, since we're talking about what we tell other people about our own preferences, I was just thinking that maybe it had something to do with it.
I think that's a great point. And this is something I haven't seen, although now I want to. Sort of the order in which information is conveyed about us to potential partners, right? What do we start? What is that tier of stuff that we start with, right? But what is the stuff that, only after 3 months comes out in terms of what we're like or what we want? Is that strategic in nature, right? Is it strategic in the way that we're doing some of that to attract somebody first and then reveal other things later, right? And how deceptive is that or not deceptive, right? It's, whether or not it's deceptive, it's in how people might perceive that, I think is really interesting. And I haven't really seen it broken down that way, and that might be really interesting.
Yeah. So in your work, I've read about exploitability cues. Could you tell us what they are about and perhaps how people go about seeing them, let's say, and taking them into account when they are deciding who to mate with?
Sure. So this is work that I had done as part of my dissertation. And it sort of started by thinking about the psychology of exploitation. So there's lots of research that, from an evolutionary perspective, where we focus a lot on our psychology that motivates cooperation. Right? So what do we do to be able to cooperate well with others when you have resources that I would like access to, what do I do to then engage in mutual exchange with you or something where, it's a mutually beneficial thing that, I can get access to those resources. Cool. And cooperative strategies are great, right? They're fantastic, but we also realize that if we look across, human relationships, other people don't always necessarily want to give us access to certain resources. And when it comes to my work, I was specifically looking at sexual access as a resource that women might be able to provide to men. And certainly there's all sorts of cooperative routes men could take to get there. But it might be the case that there's some evolved psychology there to consider exploitative strategies or pursue exploitative strategies if they can't get sexual access through those other routes, or if it's just a more effective strategy for gaining sexual access than a cooperative strategy might be. So that was sort of like the kernel that started that, line of research, was thinking, okay, well, how might that psychology of exploitation, particularly sexual exploitation, look? What might be some of the design features? What might that psychology be attuned to be triggered by, right? And that was sort of where we started with, well, if we're thinking about this psychology of sexual exploitability, one thing that this psychology might be sensitive to, among the many things it could be sensitive to, are particular cues associated with a woman herself that would indicate that an exploitative strategy might actually be more successful, might be more likely to work in this case, right, compared to some other woman. And so those were the cues to exploitability that I wanted to investigate. What might be those potential cues that psychology is in men might be attuned to that would then maybe possibly trigger pursuit of those women because they might be more vulnerable to an exploitative strategy. And so we hypothesized cues in sort of a bunch of different domains. So some of them had to do with the physical features of the woman herself. So if she was small, right, or short, right, so she's physically less capable of defending herself against some sort of sexual assault. And that was sort of one class of the cues. Some of the other cues had to do more with the context that she was in. So if she's alone, if she's isolated from other people, right? If she is in some other context where there's lots of, alcohol or drugs around, right? And so she might be less able to defend herself if she's under the influence, but also there might be fewer other people around who could help her or come to her aid if, something were to happen. And then we had a whole set of cues that really had to do with her own mental state, right? So in some of these were the specific mental state now, like intoxication, also anything else where she might be cognitively impaired or tired or fatigued, but also other characteristics about her being less intelligent. She might be less able to recognize that somebody is, has not great intentions towards her. If she's immature, she might be less aware of these things. If she's particularly naive, if she is reckless, if she's more likely to engage in risk-taking and reckless behavior, she might be more likely to end up in a situation where an exploitative strategy might be able to be enacted. And so these were all the different types of cues, and there was many of them that we tried to look at in our first pass on that. And the way that we looked at them, I got a whole bunch of pictures of women. So I think it was like 104 pictures. And I had participants look at them for these potential cues and rate the extent to which these cues were present in that picture. And then I had a separate set of participants look at those pictures and rate how exploitable the woman appeared to be, but also how sexually attractive she appeared to be, and how attractive as a long-term mate she appeared to be. Because what I really thought might be going on, could be going on with men's psychology in this domain, is that it's not that they're the design of this psychology would work such that men are, consciously thinking about engaging in exploitation, right? But rather, it could be that, well, seeing these cues to exploitability might simply just trigger sexual attraction, right? Might simply just trigger, oh, I'm interested in this woman, I want to pursue her, which then sets things up that exploitative tactics could be used in some cases once that sort of initial attraction has motivated that beginning pursuit. And that's essentially what I ended up finding. The cues that were in fact associated with exploitability, which are mostly the ones I've named, of the ones I've named, the ones that didn't really come out, the ones about being short or small in stature, that they weren't correlated with exploitability, although I think that might have been a product of like the pictures. It's hard to tell how big somebody is in a picture. But most of the others I named were perceived as being associated with sexual exploitability, and men rated women who were high on those cues to be more sexually attractive. And so this was some evidence for how some of that psychology might work to motivate men to pursue women who are displaying those cues that would indicate that that sort of strategy might be more effective.
Mm-hmm. But were these preferences that all men tended to have, or was it the case that men with certain, for example, personality traits would be more attracted to these exploitability cues than the other men?
Absolutely. So we did a couple different analyses on these data, and one of them was looking exactly at that, the individual differences in the men, to see were there differences in their sensitivity to these cues, right? Were some men sort of more likely to pick up on these cues, right? And that's exactly what we found. We found men who were single men, so unmated men, which makes sense if we're thinking about why one might be pursuing this strategy, who were more short-term oriented and lower on agreeableness, were more sensitive to these cues to exploitability. So absolutely, and I think this is a great point. Thinking about the psychology of exploitation and its evolved nature isn't making the argument that all men are going to exploit women, and I would never make that claim or suggest that, right? But it might be this menu of possible strategies that we've evolved to have, right? And depending on all sorts of things, ranging from the cues about the woman, like what I studied, but also other sorts of things, like the other strategies available to him, the other things about the culture he's in and the social norms about whether or not this is something that is really looked down upon or something that is kind of ignored and allowed. Those are just a couple of things. His experience with using these strategies, his experience with using other strategies that have or have not been successful. All of these and many, many other things we should expect to sort of feed into that psychology, and that's what's going to direct which sort of strategies a man would be more or less likely to use, in addition to personal characteristics about him, like his agreeableness, like his mating strategy, like his other attitudes he might have towards women. And so while I was looking at it from this sort of basic evolved psychology, men's exploitability psychology and what might some features of it be, certainly we should expect big individual differences on whether that's the sort of psychology that's going to be motivating many mating decisions or not.
Mm-hmm. So we have both short-term and long-term mating strategies, but particularly in our modern industrialized societies, because we are exposed to lots of different people in real life and online, and also we have easy access to things like pornography. Do you think that that could be tricking people into preferring short-term mating strategies or not?
I think it's really interesting. It's one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately are these sorts of features of our modern environment that are very different from features of our ancestral environments, right? And features that really shaped the evolution of all of our mating mechanisms, these features that are mismatched. And you're hitting on some of these really important ones, right? So things like exposure to sexually attractive people through whatever type of media, whether it's pornography, whether it's just social media in general or mass media in general, but also just the size of our societies, right? Any college student walking around a large university campus, right, might walk by 1,000 attractive people, right, in, a 20-minute span, right? And that is just, unprecedented, right? When we think about most of human evolutionary history being exposed to all of that, being, bombarded with that information. And so one possibility is certainly that if we're, thinking about the fact that we have these different strategies, we have, evolved strategies for long term, for short term, and all sorts of nuances within those big categories there. One input to those mechanisms should probably be, well, what's the availability of, sexually attractive people that might be also interested in short-term mating with me, right? If that's higher, maybe do more of this, right? And it very well could be that a lot of our, information that we get from these various media sources does, trip and trick those mechanisms into thinking, oh yeah, there's lots of options out here for this short-term thing. Let's go for this. And that's not necessarily bad. Whether or not, there's moral arguments people might want to make about the different types of mating strategies. I'm not interested in making those arguments. But I'm interested in trying to understand, what is more likely to make somebody pursue one strategy over another, or enact a particular strategy at a particular time versus a different one. And I certainly think those elements of our modern mating landscape really might hijack those mechanisms in that way. And that exposure really could be triggering, more of that behavior than we might have seen in other contexts.
Yeah, I mean, it's not important to get into the philosophy of it, if it's good or bad, or the ethics of it, because I mean that's questions for philosophers and not for evolutionary psychologists or scientists to decide.
I agree.
Right?
I
Yeah, yeah.
agree. And I don't think so. I mean, I agree. I do think that I will say that, we study, and we evolutionary psychologists broadly, we don't shy away from controversial topics. We
I
invite them
know.
often. I'm guessing is why you like talking to us. And I do think we have a responsibility to, consider these things that, you're doing research that, hits on these really controversial topics. And this came up when I was doing, that dissertation work with the exploitability stuff, right? There was, immediate backlash, right, from some people about, that I was, victim blaming, essentially, that, by investigating some of these cues, some of the cues I had looked at, I didn't mention, were things like revealing clothing, right, and her flirtatious behavior, if she appeared to be flirtatious or promiscuous. And those were other cues that were perceived as being associated with exploitability, and they were also perceived as making a woman more sexually attractive. And so, there was this backlash of, you're saying that, women are wearing revealing clothing and are out being flirtatious. They're asking to be sexually assaulted. You're terrible, right? That was some, contingent of the response I got. And I sort of laughed. I was like, I did a whole dissertation on men's psychology. And the implication that you think I'm trying to say is that women need to change their behavior. I was like, I'm not saying anyone needs to change their behavior, first of all, but the dissertation was all about men's psychology. And you went straight to, it must be about women who I'm talking about then. Maybe I was talking about men, which I also wasn't. I wasn't really drawing conclusions about what people should or shouldn't do. But I was also aware that I was going to get that kind of response. And so I was prepared with responses to that. I was prepared to be able to talk about, well, no, I'm explaining what's going on. I'm not justifying it, right? And regardless of whether or not these are particular cues that might trigger some response in men, I'm certainly not saying it's women's responsibility to change their behavior. And it certainly then doesn't make them any more culpable, right? It doesn't, it's, the same as any other type of crime, right? If I'm, leave my front door unlocked and somebody comes in and robs my house, right? They've still robbed my house. They've still committed the crime by coming into my house and doing that, right? My unlocked door doesn't change the badness of their behavior, right? And it's the same sort of thing here. We can use this research to understand who might be at risk, to understand vulnerabilities, to also understand, what's going on in people's minds, which I think is, the most important in the root of being able to change anything if that's what you want to try to do. But it's not then, implying, specific blame or there's, these specific implications about what's right and what's wrong about certain people's behavior. And so I do think evolutionary psychologists and people doing this type of research need to be prepared on those questions, need to really think through, well, what are the moral conclusions people might make, right? So you can be prepared to deal with them, but that's different from being worried about the moral implications and having that, impede your research or choose not to investigate certain questions. That I think, absolutely we need to, steer very clear of. We should investigate those questions precisely for those reasons.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating because I have, as you know, lots of evolutionary psychologists on the show because I really love the discipline. And it's very easy for people to associate evolutionary psychology to a sort of right-wing political agenda because, we are studying the evolutionary basis of human psychology, and people immediately think that we are saying that these things are, for example, biologically or genetically determined and we can't change them at all. And people on the left tend to prefer blank slatist approaches to psychology where, okay, so if we implement these measures, people will behave in this or that way that they find better. But it's not really about that. You're only describing people's evolved psychology and you're not making any value judgments. You're not saying if this is good or this is bad. It's just what it is, but it's really easy for people to make that connection.
It is. And it's interesting, too, bringing it up by thinking about the sort of political ideology side on it and the sort of blank slatist views versus having an appreciation of the biological origins of things and the evolved origins of our psychology and our behavior. Because really, if somebody is in the position of wanting to make policy, right, or wanting to affect change on some sort of societal thing, right, you'd think what they would want would be the best understanding of why something is happening to then be able to figure out how to affect change if that's their goal. And one thing that I've found so frustrating over the years is precisely that, coming from that, when you're using that blank slate perspective, it's like you've blindfolded yourself and tied an arm behind your back, and then you've got the one left that you're trying to do anything with, instead of using the full complement, the full array of information you could use to understand some phenomena, which includes its evolutionary nature, a biological nature that would then put you in a better position to understand what's going on. But there's a real resistance to it. And I think some of the things you mentioned are part of it, right? That misconception that, oh, well, if it's biological or evolved, that means we can't change it. Or if it's biological or evolved, well, that means that it's the naturalistic fallacy that you're then saying that this is good, so we wouldn't want to change it, right? Or it's excusing or justifying, bad behavior. And it's, getting at those deep-rooted misconceptions, I think is one of the challenges that evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary social scientists in general have to being able to convey their work to others and convey sort of the importance or the validity of their work is getting through many of those misconceptions.
Yeah, okay, so now talking about another topic, we've talked about how people make basically mating decisions. So when they already are in a romantic relationship, sometimes there are mate value discrepancies. So could you tell us about that, what they are about, and perhaps how they affect or they might affect romantic relationships?
Sure. So, when we talked about mate value earlier, I pointed out that people tend to mate assortatively on mate value. They tend to end up with somebody who's similar in mate value to them.
Yeah.
But they don't always. And this can be for different reasons. One, because initially there's some sort of mismatch. Somebody was deceptive about their particular characteristics or qualities. Somebody misjudged. Or maybe at the time, depending on what the pool of potential mates was, they were a good match, but then the pool of potential mates changes, and then they're no longer as good of a match. It also could be that characteristics of the two people within the partnership, or however many within the partnership or the couple or group, their own characteristics could change, right? So it could be that, oh, they were well matched in mate value, but maybe one person rises a lot in status or falls a lot in status, gains more resources, loses a lot, becomes more physically attractive, becomes less physically attractive, right? Consider all these possibilities that could then result in these discrepancies. In the research that I've done on mate value discrepancies, we've actually looked at two different, we've operationalized the idea of mate value discrepancy in two different ways. One is sort of the way we've been talking about it here, your own mate value compared to your partner's mate value. So, if you're sort of very similar, then you're well matched, but there could be a discrepancy there where one is higher than the other. But the other one that we've really looked at is your partner's mate value compared to the sort of mate value of the other possibilities that are out there for you. And the way that we've looked at that is we've gotten measures of people's ideal preferences, so what they ideally would want in a mate, right? And then we find out where their actual partner falls on all of those traits to see, well, how close is your partner to like what your ideal is? And then we've gotten sort of an assessment based on our sample of where all those other potential mates fall on all of those traits. And we've used that to determine, well, what percentage of all of those other potential mates are actually closer to your ideal preferences than your partner is. And it might be that there's not that many, right? And it's, oh, only 5% of the rest of the pool is actually closer to your ideal than your partner. Dang, you've got a really valuable partner. They're pretty close to your ideal. Like, I mean, it's not they're close to you. You don't have other options that are closer to your ideal. But it could be the other way around where, 80% of our sample here, their traits and characteristics suggest that they're actually closer to your ideal mate than what your own partner is, right? And then there's that discrepancy there between your partner and those potential partners. So those are the two mate value discrepancies that I've really looked at in my research, that discrepancy between you and your partner and that discrepancy between your partner and the other potential partners you could have. And the first study I worked on this was with Dan Conroy Beam on leading that. And we were looking specifically at relationship satisfaction. And we were really interested to see, how do these mate value discrepancies affect satisfaction within a relationship? And our argument was rooted in this idea about, well, what's the function of relationship satisfaction? As evolutionary psychologists, why do we even feel this? Like, what's going on with this? And we were arguing that relationship satisfaction, or hypothesizing that relationship satisfaction might serve as this way to regulate your own relationship behavior depending on the fitness costs and benefits that relationship is providing to you. So if it's the case that this is a really fitness beneficial relationship and the benefits largely outweigh the costs, that should motivate high satisfaction, which should then motivate behaviors to maintain that relationship, right? You want to keep that partner real fitness beneficial. But if it's the case that the partner you have is less fitness beneficial, more costly, or there might be more fitness beneficial relationships elsewhere you could go to, that should trigger lower satisfaction. That would then trigger relationship dissolution behavior, less maintenance behavior, maybe breaking up. And so we looked at these two mate value discrepancies and with relationship satisfaction. And what we found is people who were lower in mate value than their partner. So if they had a partner that was just much higher in mate value than them, they were satisfied. Makes sense. They got a good catch, right? And if they were to lose that partner, it might be difficult for them to get another one that's that much higher in mate value than them, right? For people where it was the flipped, so if they were in fact higher in mate value than their partner, their relationship satisfaction changed depending on the availability of alternatives. So if they were higher in mate value than their partner, but there weren't other options that were actually closer to their ideal preferences than their current partner, they were still pretty satisfied. Because even though they're higher in mate value and they've got a lower in mate value partner, they don't have a bunch of other options to look to. So it makes sense to want to maintain and invest and stay in that relationship. But as there were more and more alternatives available that better matched their preferences than their partner, people reported lower and lower relationship satisfaction. And so this supported our hypothesis that relationship satisfaction there is about, toggling some of your relationship motivations and behavior based on the fitness, costs, and benefits of your current partnership versus not being in your current partnership. And we also then found that in those studies, there were sort of 3 studies in that paper, we found that this also predicted what's called mate retention behavior, so specific behaviors we do to help keep our mate. And it was the case that, if you were higher in relationship satisfaction as predicted by those mate value discrepancies, you then engaged in more mate retention behavior versus if you were lower in relationship satisfaction, you were engaging in less mate retention behavior.
Yeah, I was thinking about mate retention tactics. So perhaps people that are lower in mate value and are paired with someone with high mate value would resort to more mate retention tactics.
Yep. And so we should expect that. And there has been some analyses that have sort of divided up, it's not my research, but some of those mate retention tactics into different categories and looked at sort of precisely what you're looking at. When there's mate value discrepancies, do they engage in some more of these types or less of these types? Because those mate retention behaviors do lump into different kinds. So there's ones that are sort of the benefit bestowing mate retention behaviors. These are the ones that we all like. We're like, oh, my partner made me dinner. Oh, my partner does nice things with me. They complimented me, right? All those sort of positive things. But there's also the mate retention behaviors that are the cost-inflicting ones, right? So, oh, my partner's checking my phone all the time to see who I'm talking to. Oh, my partner, if they see me talking to somebody of my preferred sex, they, get in there and kind of block me from talking to them, right? All of those sorts of things. And you can get even, there's, when we look at the range of mate retention behaviors, there's the, even more negative ones. So things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, right? Also sort of fit within this framework as trying to maintain your partner. And so there has been some evidence looking at across the different behaviors with mate value for the different types that people are doing. There is at least one study that demonstrated that men who were lower in mate value do more of the cost-inflicting ones. And so there's some of that looking at that. But in general, there's the evidence related to sort of those, the mate value discrepancies and, engaging in the mate retention behavior does sort of support this idea that, oh, if it's discrepant and you're the one who wants to try to maintain this person, you're doing more of the mate retention behaviors.
Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk now about a couple of concepts, starting with the concept of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, because I think that this is a crucial one in the context of evolutionary psychology. What is it? What is the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, and how can we be sure about what it is about?
It's a great question. So the EEA is how we abbreviate it for simplicity. Yeah. And the thing about the idea of the EEA, roughly we can think about it as the environment to which an organism is adapted. However, using that rough definition also then leads to confusion. So, it is good for us to dial down to the real technical definition or the more technical definition. And the idea of the EEA is that it's adaptation specific. So really the EEA is sort of the set of selection pressures that have shaped the evolution of a particular adaptation. And so, yeah, it is the environment to which an organism is evolved, right? Because if you're looking across, all of these different adaptations, right, that's, what's going on. But really the EEA is this adaptation-specific thing, and that's how we should think about it. Okay, we're studying this particular adaptation or hypothesized adaptation. We want to think about, well, what are the specific selection pressures? What are the specific features of the environment that shaped the evolution of this particular adaptation? That also means that, the EEA for an adaptation, continues, in perpetuity, essentially, right? Because while, when an adaptation might have arisen 150,000 years ago, right? But it's still being affected by evolution and by natural selection, right? So, we're thinking about it as that entire time span. But that also means the EEA for adaptations differs depending on the time span, right? So the eye evolved multiple times, but many eons ago, right? Versus something that is 10,000 years old, right? And so those adaptations have different EEAs of different lengths. And then they're also affected by different selection pressures, right? So a jealousy adaptation, right? That might be an adaptation that's very much influenced and affected by, your partner's behavior, right? Whereas some other adaptation might not be very sensitive to your partner's behavior because that's not, the selection pressures that shaped the evolution of that particular adaptation. So with the EEA, that's what it's about. It's about thinking about, okay, for particular adaptations, what are the set of selection pressures that shaped the evolution of this adaptation? And it's really a really important concept for evolutionary psychologists because, we're steeped in thinking about, our mind as a collection of adaptations. So we want to, understand, well, where do these come from? But I think it's also really important because we live now in a time, and the people we study now are often living in circumstances where the current environment very much differs from the EEA for many adaptations. It may have been the case that for many of our mating adaptations, they evolved in an environment and were operating in an environment for a very, very long time that was a certain way, and now there's features of our environment that are really different. And by understanding and thinking about the EEA, we can better think about, well, how did these adaptations actually evolve to work? And that puts us in a better position then to think, okay, well, now they're operating in this environment. How might the differences in our environment play out, right? How might this affect these adaptations, or how might it not affect the adaptations, right? And that's why it's key for evolutionary psychologists thinking about that concept of the EEA.
Right. So, but one criticism that some people put forth against this concept is perhaps it's a bit simplistic, the interpretation that they make of it, but they say basically that we've evolved in different environments, different human populations evolved in different environments, different contexts, and so there would have never been an environment of evolutionary adaptedness. We would have several. So, I mean, and they say that if evolutionary psychologists assume that we evolved in a particular environment and we evolved across different environments, then the adaptations they point to the ones that we were supposedly exposed to selective pressures that were present in that EEA, let's say, that they really didn't work that way.
I mean, and I think it's a great point for, again, the understanding of what we mean by EEA, because we aren't talking about one unitary environment, right? We specifically aren't, where the inherent in the definition is that it's adaptation specific. But also, there's certainly a kernel of truth there in the criticism that for different adaptations, we do have different levels of knowledge about what the EEA for that adaptation may or may not have been. We have different levels of certainty, and that's absolutely true. I'll go back to jealousy because it's a nice one to think about sometimes. So we have some well-documented sex differences in upset at sexual infidelity, and the argument there from an evolutionary perspective is that men demonstrate greater upset at the threat of sexual infidelity and the actual occurrence of sexual infidelity. Because this links back to the fact that we are a species that has internal fertilization. So, offspring, fertilization happens internally and gestation happens internally. So men can never be absolutely 100% certain that any offspring that their partner has is theirs, right? Unless they have had eyes on her 100% of the time, they don't know for sure. There's the potential for paternity uncertainty. And so it would then benefit men from an evolutionary perspective to be more jealous at the possibility of sexual infidelity, at the threat of sexual infidelity to protect his own genetic interests. Now, think about the selection pressure we're talking about here. It's the fact that internal fertilization is a feature of humans, right? And that women are the ones who get pregnant and men aren't, right? that's the sort of selection pressure that we can be pretty certain, right, was a feature of our ancestral environments, right? So it's rooted in this, very sort of clear element of human biology, right? We also have all sorts of evidence from people now, but also people in lots of cultures and societies that we do have these multiple mating strategies and people aren't perfectly monogamous with each other. That also gives us, some decent evidence that ancestrally people might not have been perfectly monogamous with each other. And so it's these sorts of pieces of evidence that we can draw upon to try to make these sort of come to these conclusions about ancestral environments. With jealousy, I think those are some, good solid pieces of evidence to be ground on. There's also great evidence when we think about the world of sort of evolutionary medicine. I think hits on this a lot really well with the differences in how, modern medicine, modern technology have affected things like infant mortality. And there's, prior to that, lots of infants died, lots of children died without being able to be protected from diseases, parasites, various things, but also other stuff in the environment, right, that could kill you. Or other birth defects, things like that. That's another sort of, we can make sort of solidly grounded statements about those differences and what ancestrally things were like versus now. But absolutely, I do think there's some things that we should be really cautious about making claims about, right? Making really specific claims about the macronutrient makeup of ancestral humans' diet, or really specific claims. Even, I've said, I said, oh, jealousy, people, we have evidence people engage in all these different sexual strategies and mating strategies, but I'd be really careful about making claims about exactly how much, or how much was this, or how much was that. And that probably likely varied a lot across different cultures and different groups. And so it's, a well-taken criticism that we have to be really cautious in thinking about what claims we want to make about, how ancestral environments were. But we also have really great sources of evidence for some of those claims. And so when we can make those claims well, we should make those claims well.
Right. And so since you've explained the concept of the EEA, at a certain point you were mentioning that, for example, since now we live in societies, people that live in industrial societies, because we still have hunter-gatherers and so on, but we now live in societies that have many features that are different from the ones that were present in societies where we evolved in, like hunter-gatherers, for example. And that leads us to the concept of evolutionary mismatch, right?
Yes. And I've specifically been thinking about this a lot lately with respect to human mating, because that's what I study. And so in the kind of work that I've been doing a lot of, most of it's pretty theoretical at this point. I've got some data collection I want to be doing soon, but in really thinking about, what are the features and the particular characteristics of our modern environments that we should be really aware of as evolutionary psychologists studying mating, right? To really think about with our, both with ourselves and also with the participants we're often studying, the subjects we're often studying. Because the truth of the matter is, we're often studying, people in Western countries, often university students, and we really have to take that into account, right, when we're trying to draw conclusions from them about the evolved nature of the mind, right? There's, depending on sort of the adaptation you're interested in looking at, it might be that there's different features of our current environment that you should really be attuned to. But some of them that I've noted that I think are probably really important are one that we've already mentioned. So exposure to social media and mass media, I think, is one that matters probably a lot for our mating mechanisms. Our sense of what our pool of potential mates is may be very different in a modern university student than it would have been in a person living 100,000 years ago. So that's one. Linked to that is just the fact that we have lots of options. So separate from our exposure to social media, it's simply true that we have lots of options. Again, that university student, they don't even have to get on, social media or look at mass media when they walk across that campus and can see option after option after option after option, which also is very different than the sort of environment in which, human mating adaptations really evolved. I think some other key features are things like the degree to which we can move around and are relocatable. So if, we're thinking about some of these less savory elements of human mating psychology, right? Things related to sexual exploitation, sexual assault, deception, any of those things that might go on in the world of mating, when you can more easily get away and when you are really anonymous in a big society, it might set things up so those strategies are less costly to pursue. And so ancestrally, that might not have been the case if you're in small group living. You can only get away with being so deceitful before everybody in the group knows that you're the person who's lying. And those sorts of strategies, might be easier to enact in our modern environment. And so it's a really interesting question to think about with some of those strategies, when we're seeing them manifest in our modern environment, right? What does that say about the evolution of these strategies, the psychology producing these strategies, right? Is it the case that this was something that ancestrally, could have happened as much? Or is it the case that, they're, much more modern phenomena? Or is it the case that ancestrally the context in which these things would have occurred are very different and then how they're occurring in the modern environment? I think sexual assault is maybe a great example of that. We certainly have good evidence that in warfare contexts throughout human history, that's when women were often most vulnerable to being assaulted by men from outside the group who were coming in. If we look at modern sexual assault, it's often people the women know who are more likely to assault them, but their fears seem to be toggled and shaped a little bit by those ancestral circumstances. Women report much greater fear of stranger rape than they do of acquaintance rape. But in our modern environment, acquaintance rape is the greater threat. And so it could be this mismatch where those adaptations in women to protect themselves from sexual assault are, shaped based on an environment that's very different than the modern landscape of sexual assault, and leaves them ill-prepared to be worried about the greater threat, which would be somebody they know versus somebody they don't know. And so I've kind of gone off on a tangent here as I've been talking about these different cues, but these are some of the, particularly important features I think about our modern environment. Some of the other ones that I've talked about are the autonomy that people often have in their mate choice now. If we look at, modern small-scale societies and historical information we have about mate choice, there's historically been lots of parental influence on people's mate choice or
arranged marriages, for example.
Arranged marriages, exactly. And particularly for women and particularly for young women for their first marriage or partnership, lots of input and control coming from others. And we don't have that now in many cases. In many Western societies now, children, at some point have, all sorts of autonomy in who they're picking, right? And that's a really cool question to think about. Do they make better choices because of it? Because it's just their own preferences that are creating this decision or leading to this choice? Or do they actually make worse choices because the psychology evolved to take in input from parents and others, and without that input, they're kind of left with, a dearth of information to actually make decisions about, is this somebody I want to be with or not? We know people are getting married later and partnering less overall, and so is it a consequence of there being that less input and information coming in from these other sources about who you should be with or who you shouldn't be with? So it's another sort of feature of our modern environments. And I think thinking about these things, there's multiple ways in which it can help us as researchers and just people trying to understand this stuff. One, it helps you kind of come up with new hypotheses and new directions of study. Oh, well, yeah, let's study, how people's mating decisions, if they have parental input or not, how successful are they, right? I mean, that's a research question you now have by thinking about it that way. But then there's the other piece of it, especially that evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary social scientists need to think about. because we've steeped ourselves in this discipline where we want to understand the underlying universal design of the mind, right? We want to understand human nature. We make these claims that that's what we want to do, and if we're going to do that, we're trying to draw conclusions from whatever population we study to then make these grand claims, right, about human nature and what it is and how it works. And so we have to be really careful, right, that if we're studying this small slice of people who are unique and have these particular features about them, but particularly have these mismatched features, we just want to be careful about what conclusions we're then drawing from them about the design of the mind. And I think this is a challenge that's particular to us. Lots of other social scientists or psychologists, they don't make claims that they're trying to understand human nature. They say, oh, I want to understand these specific people doing this specific thing and what happens. And so they don't have that same burden of having to think about this in the same way.
Yeah. Okay, so let's end the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Most of my stuff is just up on Google Scholar, so it's the easiest way to find it, and it is where I have, collected all of it. So that's where you can easily find me. I will I'll end it there. We're good.
Okay. So, Dr. Goetz, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. My channel is now more than 3 years old, and to keep it sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pereira Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Viss, Elenian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Usmani, Charlotte Please, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran. And finally, my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.